Welcome to Sports Connections with David Smale, a podcast that brings fun and interesting connections throughout sports. As an author and sports journalist, David has been interviewing fascinating people in sports for more than 40 years. Now here's your host, David Smale.
Steve Wieberg spent 30 years doing many of us in sports journalism would have loved to do. He was the main college writer for USA Today, part of the original sports staff for that newspaper, while also covering other sports in the Kansas City area. He is the first person to predict the NCAA men's basketball tournament field for all to see. I mean, we all predicted who we thought would be in there, but he was the first one brave enough to do it in public. And he did it more than a decade before Joe Lunardi invented bracketology. He was very successful at predicting the field. We'll ask him about that in just a second. He also covered the old Big 8 conference and its successor, the Big 12 conference, telling stories about championship teams in football and basketball and probably some other sports. He also covered Major League Baseball and the NFL. Graduated from the renowned journalism school at the University of Missouri in 1976. He worked as a sports reporter at two Missouri newspapers, the Mexico Ledger and the Springfield News Leader, before joining the staff at USA Today. Football Playoff Selection Committee, serving from 2014 to 2018. And he also received the Burt McGrain Award from the Football Writers Association of America. So he's not only well-versed, but he's well-respected. So Steve, welcome to Sports Connections.
Dave, it's a pleasure to be here.
Now, that's a lot of accolades. I got to ask you, is the wall in your den big enough to put up all that stuff?
No, there's not a lot up around, and I think you make it sound like it's a little more flowery than what it has been. I'm like anybody else who did something for more than 3 decades. I've got a lot of mementos, and I have a few things up. And that's what it is. It's primarily mementos. I've got some mementos from the 1985 World Series, for example, that I covered, the Cardinals and the Royals. When, by the way, we were living in Washington, D.C. at the time. That was, 3 years into USA Today. Our twin sons had been born a month earlier.
Oh, wow.
And I had actually made arrangements with the paper to not travel for a year because it was just my wife and I, and twin 1-month-old then sons in Washington, D.C., no family. And the paper was nice enough for me not to travel, but the Cardinals, I don't recall the order. One night the Cardinals clinched, the next night the Royals, or vice versa. And I'm driving into the office, and our sports editor at the time, Henry Freeman, calls me in and says, "Look, I know that you're not traveling." He said, "But we figure you know these two teams as well as anybody. I'd love to have you do the series." I said, "Well, let me call Paula and see what she would think about it." So I called her. And by the way, when I was driving into work that day, I had this tingle in me. It was the Cardinals and the Royals. It really was special. So I called Paula and I said, "Henry wants me to cover the World Series." He didn't assign it. I told him I'd check with you. And she said, "Well, if she said, I'm not going to make it easy for you and just say, go ahead and do it." She said, "You have to make that decision. You have to make that decision on your own."
Yeah.
The fact that I have some 1985 World Series memorabilia will tell you where I came out on that. I really probably didn't skip a beat and just said, "Well, honey, I hope you understand it's the Cardinals and the Royals."
Yeah.
And so, of course, it was a 7-game series. I was gone for 2+ weeks. She was in Washington with twin 1-month-olds. But we survived. The marriage survived. And but I've got some World Series memorabilia. I covered 8 Summer and Winter Olympics. I've got some memorabilia from that. I've got some simply because I think it's probably one of the highlights of certainly my professional career, if not the highlight, from my 4 years on the College Football Playoff Selection Committee.
Now, you talk about the memorabilia. For people who may visit you, they'll look at that and kind of remember where they were when they watched it for you, I'm sure it triggers memories of being there and being a part of it. And that's the memories are probably far more valuable to you than the memorabilia, aren't they?
Absolutely. And, it was, and you've done this as well. Um, there certainly is an enjoyment, sometimes a thrill to witnessing sports history if you're at a series. And that Royals series, it really was special for Kansas City. And uh, you know, by the time Motley clutches that last fly ball in Game 7, regardless, and I grew up with the Cardinals. I lived more to the eastern side of the state growing up. But by the end of that series, you just thought it's not justice if the Royals don't win this. And indeed they did. And I enjoyed being a part of that. I covered the McGuire-Sosa home run exchange when it came to Kansas City or to St. Louis, just a huge thing.
Yeah.
That year. And I don't think I ever, at sitting courtside at the Final Four at the national championship game in particular, didn't sit there courtside and think to myself, wow, this is what you get to do.
Yeah.
And, I never lost that. But the bigger part for me was just the relationships that you form.
Sure.
The friendships that you form, in some cases with coaches, in some cases with athletes, in some cases with either front office personnel or college athletic administrators, conference commissioners, and so forth. And I valued that, but also, and maybe even more so, just among fellow sports writers.
Right.
It was such a fraternity. And with USA Today, it's a little different now, but at the time I was doing it, we went to every single big event, the biggest college football game on a given Saturday. And there were a cluster of national college football writers of the day who all went to the same game. We were all close. We had a routine. We'd basically stay in the same Marriott hotel, check in on Friday. We'd all have dinner together on Friday nights. We'd ride together to the games on Saturday. It's something I look back on and treasure.
And many of those are fellow Missouri alums, aren't they? Like, I'm guessing Tom Chattel was there, and Dennis Dodd, and guys like that were probably maybe not in your class, but in, overlapped a little bit at Mizzou, weren't they?
Exactly. Enjoyed running into them. I mean, yeah, they were a little behind me, but loved running into them. And I mean, it's kind of funny. So we all come out of Missouri, and I assume it's still kind of a running joke in Columbia, that, every year you had this incoming class of freshmen pre-journalism students who were all going to be the next Woodward and Bernstein.
Yeah.
And, I think Columbia just shuddered at all of these wide-eyed, going to be aggressive, going to make my mark students. And nobody more so, I think, than probably the MU coaches, football and basketball coaches. Norm Stewart, I think Norm used to just shake his head, and he could be tough to deal with. He could be kind of prickly, but what was, I've always clutched on to. Later, we became his boys. And I still remember it was a Final Four in New Orleans. And I think it was on a Friday night before the semifinals in New Orleans. And a bunch of us were kind of roaming the French Quarter, as were, 250,000 other people, I think. And we actually run into Norm out on the streets of the French Quarter. And, now he wants, of course, there's me and a number of other, former Missouri graduate or journalism graduates, and he wants his picture taken with all of us because we're now his boys. We drove him nuts, while we were on campus and while we were chasing down stories. And some of us probably drove him nuts even after we became professional journalists. But I think he took some pride in some of the journalism students that came out of there. And I still do remember, I don't remember what establishment it was now, that we ducked inside and we all gathered for a photo with Norm at his insistence.
Cool. Now, as a sports writer for a number of years, I know how hard it is to follow one team. You managed to cover an entire conference and then eventually expand that to cover big stories from across the country. How in the world did you keep everything straight?
Well, it's not too hard. I mean, and um, uh, right now you and I could sit here now and tick off what are the biggest sports stories in the country and narrow that down further to what are the biggest sports stories in the in college football, college basketball. And there was no pandemic, which of course is the single biggest story. And
Right.
there was no college football playoff, but at that time there were all these expansive bowls. So at this time of year, basically we were getting ready for the Orange Bowl. I mean, I every year would uh, get up. I can still remember getting up every December 26th in the middle of the night to catch a plane to go to Miami or to New Orleans or to Phoenix, to go to Tempe for national championship football games. But you look at it from 30,000 feet, and again, going back to the thrill of being able to do this job. I mean, we could look. I still remember David Leon Moore was our other lead college football writer at USA Today, and we would get together over dinner one night in August, and we would pull out the schedule, and we would pick the two at that what looked to be
Right.
the biggest games in the country that week. And David would say, "Okay, I'll take this one," and I'd say, "I'll take this one," and we divvied them up, I think, through probably September until the season started to sort itself out. But basically, we just chose which biggest game in the country that we wanted to go to, and we went.
But
And
the hard part of that, Steve, is when you'd get there, you'd be expected to know as much about the two teams involved as Tim Fitzgerald covering Kansas State or Mike DeArmond covering Missouri, or people who were on that beat day in and day out. You were it's easy to say, well, we looked at it from 30,000 feet, but you had to land the plane and go there and be one of the experts on those teams. How hard was that?
not that difficult. For one thing, in a lot of cases, you would lean on those local writers.
Okay.
Um, if you were wanting to dig into a specific aspect, of a team, you got to know all of the beat writers from the various teams, and you would say, "Tell me a little bit about this." And
Right.
and also, you after doing this for a while, you got to know the coaches. You could get a little bit of maybe additional time with them. Working for a national publication sometimes opens some doors.
Right.
I mean, I still remember whatever year it was going into Bo Jackson's senior year at Auburn, and talking to the officials there and saying I wanted to come in and do a piece on Bo, and I'd really like to get him away from I don't want to interview him in the locker room or
Right.
In the football office. I'd kind of like to get him into a more natural setting. He and I went fishing for the afternoon. I've got photos of Bo and me sitting out in a boat in the middle of some farm pond outside of, Auburn, Alabama.
Yeah.
And, he's reeling in catch after catch after catch. All I'm doing is worrying about, okay, don't hook him in the eye. The other thing is you writing this, and I was always one for trying to look for some aspect of a story that most people knew a lot about, but some hidden aspect of it,
Right.
some untold aspect of it. I mean, that was the Bo example allowed me to do something with him and kind of present a side of Bo that the public certainly didn't see, and that, I don't think a lot of other reporters necessarily thought to do. And so there was also a challenge in doing it too, because they are national stories. Most
Right.
people do know most everything about them, and it's your job to come up and with something and present something in a different way, or present something new that gave maybe a familiar story a fresh spin.
Now, I know you said the best part of it was the relationships that you built, whether it's coaches, players, fellow media members, or whatever. But I'm going to ask you to pick a favorite, either a favorite sport to cover or a favorite event to cover. Maybe it was the primary bowl game, maybe it was the Final Four. What was your favorite sport or event to cover?
I would probably say the NCAA basketball tournament, and particularly the first 2 days.
Yeah.
There was nothing like those first 2 days, and the ones playing the 16 seeds, the two playing the 15 seeds, watching the games that you were covering. And then at halftime, you'd rush back into the press room to catch the TV and see what all was going on in the other games. This was pre-internet, of course, so you didn't have all of this flashing on your screen. There was just nothing like that. And I love the tournament all the way through, including the Final Four. But from that first round of the tournament, it kind of increasingly just became a big event, and maybe became a little less enjoyable for me. That's not to say it was unenjoyable,
right?
But I loved those first 2 rounds. And then the other thing that I really enjoyed was the Olympics, simply because it was a cultural experience,
right?
The overseas Olympics, and even I covered the LA Olympics. I covered the in '84, I covered Atlanta. Even those are cultural experiences because of all the international, certainly athletes and press and other officials, who are involved in it. But the overseas ones, I would always, try to take some time. I was built out 3 days after the Olympics to stay and just be able to be a tourist for 3 days. But from the Olympics, from getting there a week early, through the games themselves, through the closing ceremonies, very much enjoyed, just the cultural experience of that.
What events did you cover? Or did you just jump from event to event in Atlanta?
At USA Today, we kind of made the Olympics our specialty, and we were, I think, the only paper that would really assign an individual. We sent enough people that an individual person could cover each significant sport. And but the nice thing was, in '84, for example, my first Olympics, I did gymnastics, which I had never done before, which, that was Mary Lou Retton, and
right.
It was
At Poly Pavilion.
Yeah. And then I did swimming and diving. And then in '88 in Seoul, I covered I covered basketball, and did of course, the last college team of college basketball players and coach, and John Thompson, and really got to know John Thompson, I think, very well from that experience, and well enough, and was kind of close enough to him that I was really saddened when he died earlier this year. I really thought a lot of John, and so over the course of the Olympics, I wasn't our main person on the dream team in Barcelona, but I did do some basketball. Our NBA writer jumped in on them because those were NBA players, but I did do some dream team in Barcelona. And then you get called into, there might be a big story that would develop in rifle, or in judo, and I loved kind of doing those too, because those were athletes that you could actually kind of get close to, and they appreciated the coverage because they didn't typically get the coverage. This was their once in every 4 years
Right.
window of attention. And so I kind of enjoyed that. Yeah, you like to be where the big stories were and all the attention was, whether it was basketball or gymnastics or swimming and diving. But I did enjoy kind of doing those quote secondary sports.
And I got to cover basketball the whole time. I worked for ACOG, for the Atlanta Committee for the Olympic Games, and I was on the press information team covering basketball. And there's a couple things that you mentioned that brought that to mind. One, sitting courtside for 42 games in 16 days. And one time I'm watching Korea against Angola, a women's game, and I swear that I could have picked 4 other people in the stands and we could have beaten either one of those teams. Now, it's probably not true, but that's how I felt. And I started feeling sorry for myself. And then I kind of, slapped myself in the face and said, you're getting paid to cover basketball courtside at the Olympic Games. Stop whining.
Yeah.
But the other part of it was just the cultural thing. I'd ride MARTA, the Metro Atlanta Rapid Transit Authority, basically the trains.
Right.
And every night after the games, I'd go past the Olympic Village, but for a while I'd be on there with a gymnast from Bulgaria and a wrestler from, Czechoslovakia and a swimmer from China. And they're in their warm-up gear and stuff. And, they're just human beings. And that was a really cool thing for me to see, to interact with them. And I always would say, welcome to the United States. I hope you're enjoying your visit. And sometimes they would nod and sometimes they wouldn't because they didn't understand what I was saying. But it was just really neat to see all those cultures blending so well together. And I'm guessing that's one of the highlights for you, what you were talking about with seeing that it was more than a sporting event. It was a cultural event.
Yeah, one of my more memorable experiences was in Seoul in 1988. Then again, I was doing basketball, and the Russians ultimately beat the U.S. In those games. And but I wanted to do a piece on the Soviet team. That was the Sabonis, Marciulionis. It was a great team.
Right.
A number of future prominent NBA players, and I was able to find out where they were practicing. They were practicing someplace in the middle of Seoul, and I got a taxi to take me there. And the taxi driver had a hard time, finding where it was. And we finally get there, but it's just as practice is ending. In fact, they're getting on the bus. And I make my way over to the Olympic official, I think, who's escorting them. And I said, look, is it possible to talk to, Alexander Gomelsky, the coach, just for a little bit before they take off? And he goes up on the bus. Gomelsky's on the bus. I think he's sitting by the window. And pretty soon I see Gomelsky through the window just go,
Oh, wow.
out. I actually rode on the Soviet team bus from that practice facility in the middle of Seoul all the way back to the Olympic Village. And in fact, it stops at the gate of the Olympic Village. I'm still talking to Gomelsky, who's great, and he allows me to talk to a few of the players, and it was wonderful. But we stop at the Olympic Village, and of course, nobody but Olympic athletes are allowed inside the Olympic Village unless you've gone through credentialing and everything. Yeah. And they're about to run me through in the bus, and I stop and say, I think I better get out here. So I stop them at the gate and I get out. But one of my more memorable kind of cultural immersions there.
Yeah.
And of course, in Atlanta, an unforgettable part of the Atlanta games, of course, was getting the phone call in the middle of the night about the bombing.
Yeah.
And having to jump into that,
Sure.
And into a completely different kind of an Olympic story.
Did you have a least favorite? Or I've talked to several people who have covered a lot of different things. Talked to Doug Tucker recently, And I said, what was your favorite? He said, what season is it? And is that the way you approached it? Or did you have a least favorite sport or event to cover?
I don't think so. I looking back, I mean, originally, so USA Today starts in 1982. I came in from the Springfield News Leader in Springfield, um, which was a Gannett paper. USA Today was started by Gannett. They brought in people whom they wanted from various Gannett newspapers around the country. So I got there, and they must have decided that this guy from Southwest Missouri would make a good NASCAR rider, which I knew absolutely nothing about, but I still remember. So, of course, I'm not going to say no.
Yeah.
And I go to my first NASCAR event. I knew nothing about the sport. And it's the Atlanta Journal 500. I won't get into the details, but it was just probably one of the most miserable days of my professional life. And nothing against the sport, nothing against the people in the sport. I just didn't know it. I was out of my comfort level. And I got back. We were living in Washington at the time, papers headquartered there, and went in that Monday and just said, look, you can send me back to Springfield and I'll understand. But I think that if I'm going to be the NASCAR rider for USA Today full time, it'll be a miserable experience for me. And they said, hey, no problem. Glad you let us know now.
Yeah.
And I switched off to college football and college basketball, which were my primary loves anyway. So it worked out well. Interestingly enough, we lived for 7 years in Washington, but then I talked the paper into allowing me to move back here into the Kansas City area. It's when the NCAA was headquartered here. But while living here, then I would catch NASCAR when it came through the Kansas Speedway.
Right.
Didn't mind it quite so much because I wasn't the lead rider. I wasn't expected to really know the ins and the outs. And, I kind of enjoyed the spectacle of it. I didn't mind doing something different once a year.
Right.
And I would just kind of pray that, it just was a by the numbers race, and that there were no major crashes and serious injuries, or, that no huge story broke out.
Yeah. Going back to your college basketball and football, when you first started, the Big Eight was full of characters among the coaches, especially in basketball, probably so in football as well, but especially in basketball. And you mentioned Norm Stewart. Do you have any favorite stories about interactions with those basketball coaches? I'm thinking of Johnny Orr at Iowa State, and Billy Tubbs at Oklahoma, and Norm Stewart and Jack Hartman. And you could go down. There's probably not a school that didn't have a character as the head basketball coach. Those were fun days. Did you have any favorite stories?
You're right. And they were all good coaches too.
Yeah.
They were all really good coaches. Tubbs is a guy who comes to mind. I was at the game, as it turned out, because it was a game between two top 5 teams, Missouri and Oklahoma. The infamous game.
I know what you're going to go to.
Missouri gets way ahead in the game, 26-8 or something like that, and there are some controversial officiating calls, and people start throwing some things onto the court, and I think it was Hightower who was officiating the game.
Yeah.
And goes over to Tubbs and asks him if he could tell the fans to stop throwing things on the court. Of course, we don't know that's what's going on. We just see Tubbs get the microphone at the stoppage and play, and says, just deadpan, the referees request that regardless of how terrible the officiating is, do not throw stuff on the floor. And of course, immediate tee, the place goes nuts. Oklahoma, Missouri hits 2 free throws. Oklahoma storms back, wins the game. But that was just so classic Billy Tubbs. And you mentioned the bracketology thing, and this wasn't the first year I did it. I'll tell you when it was the year, it might've been the second year. It was the year after Princeton threw the huge scare into Georgetown
Yeah.
in the first round. So the year after that, I put my bracket together. It runs on Friday, and then there's the Big 8 tournament at Kemper Arena that I would go to and cover. And there's press conferences, and before the Oklahoma press conference, and I'm kind of sitting in the press seating area waiting for it to start, and Billy walks up onto the stage and he sits down and he sees me and he says, and I had them paired with, with Princeton in my bracket. And he gets up there and he's kind of looking out and he sees me and then he says, Princeton, they better not dare. but which that was kind of indicative. Those coaches took those brackets to heart, just like they did with, back then, just as they do with Lenardi today. And back then it was the only thing of its kind then. We were the only ones doing that. And so ours were the only ones that they could look at and try to evaluate and react to.
I love it when the coaches say they don't pay any attention to that. As you know, I helped Joe Lenardi write a book that'll be out in March about the history of bracketology. And I've interviewed a bunch of coaches about it. And at the Big 12 Media Day before last season, the one that I really wanted to interview was Shaka Smart, now at Texas, because Joe tells the story that when he was at VCU in 2011, the year they reached the Final Four from the first four, Joe had them in his first four out. And as they reached the Final Four, Shaka Smart says, I hope Lenardi never puts us in the tournament because it's good luck for us. And there was some back and forth stuff. And of course, at the time he was in the A-10 and Joe worked for St. Joe's. So he would see him periodically and they had a fun relationship and stuff. So I walk up to Shaka Smart and I said, I'm doing some work with Joe Lenardi for a book on the history of bracketology. What's your thought about bracketology? And he goes, I don't give it any consideration whatsoever. And it, I thought about not putting that in there because it doesn't build up the thing, but I did them alphabetically, the comments. And so right after Bill Self talking about how great it is for the fans, and he looks at it not to see if they're in because they're going to be in every year, but to see who they might be playing so they can, if they get a little downtime, they can say, okay, well, it might be St. Louis University or it might be Weber State or something like that. So they can just do this. So he's talking all about this. And then there's a one-line thing. I don't pay any attention to it at all. And so we left it in. And I told Joe every time I would read through the proofs and get there, I'd laugh out loud because it was so funny. But these coaches absolutely pay attention, especially if they're on the bubble.
Well, you're absolutely right. And, I have kind of a funny story about the first year that I did it because, again, back then, nobody else had done it. And I'm trying to remember the year it was. I'd started doing bracketology in the late 80s. And USA Today was published Monday through Friday, and then we didn't have a weekend paper, still doesn't. And there was no internet. So I would have to get my bracket done late Thursday night to run in Friday's paper. And I still remember in the SEC, I just went, and I really took it to heart. I mean, the first thing you have to do, and all of this from talking to Joe, who has, took it from what he took it from what I did and has just made it an absolute science. And then ESPN is brilliantly marketed.
Right.
And
he gives ESPN full credit for the popularity, for sure.
Yeah, we didn't call it bracketology. We weren't smart enough to do that. It was the USA Today bracket. people, editors inside the paper called it the road to Wieberg. But I took it seriously, starting with understanding the principles and how you did slot teams and the rules that you had to follow to put them in, to bracket those teams. And then, there was no internet again. So I had individual sheets of paper with the schedules that I would literally write the outcomes in every morning. And then I would analyze strength of schedule, and I really took it to heart. And so anyway, that first year, Alabama, I don't know what to do with them. I think they may have finished second in the SEC, but they really didn't play anybody. And I just went back and forth and ultimately I left them out. So they play in the SEC tournament, and it's in, I think, Knoxville, Tennessee that year. And I get a phone call that Friday from a buddy of mine who's covering the tournament and saying, "Holy cow, Wimp Sanderson just ripped you up and down for not having them in the field. You can't believe it." And, first indication that coaches do pay attention.
Yeah.
And so then they win their first game. And my buddy called me back and said, "Wimp just ripped the hell out of you in the post game, just went off on you again." Anyway, all the way through, they win the SEC tournament. Alabama does. Now, in my defense, I am not disproven. Okay, they're going to be in the tournament, but they made it automatic because they won. But I do remember I called Wimp. I managed to get him. I knew what hotel they were in Knoxville, and I got him on the phone somehow or another while the tournament was going on, and he just went off, on me personally. And I kind of tried to make light of it and said, "Well, Wimp, the nice thing about it is, doesn't matter what I think. It's it's the committee. The hell it doesn't. They read what you have in there. That influences them." And so anyway, they win the tournament. And so that Monday, the first thing that I did afterwards was track down a florist shop in Tuscaloosa and had them send balloons to Wimp at his offices at the University of Alabama with the message, "You were right. I was full of hot air. Congratulations." But a good example of how closely coaches paid attention to it. Yeah. And then secondly, in his case, and I had other coaches say they thought, well, yeah, that's going to influence the committee because they're reading that stuff. And well, no, they're not. And now so many people do it. That's not a factor. And Joe does it in the case of, you're talking about Bill Self. I mean, those coaches are going to look at it. They know what the work that Joe puts into it. And they know that Joe's, not just looking at it with a layman's eyes. They know that he's looking at it strategically. He's looking at it knowledgeably.
Right.
And, they're going to get a pretty good idea of maybe who they at least have a shot of playing.
Yeah.
It's hard to nail down the exact matchups.
Right.
But, the coaches respect what he's doing. And that's the great thing about doing it. It's probably the best thing I ever have done, simply because nobody had done it to that point. And I, in all truth and in advertising here, I mean, I picked up the idea from the ACC beat writers who, when they covered the ACC tournament every year, what they would do then in the press room when it was over was stay up late at night, and they would just in the press room put together their own field. And I thought that's a pretty cool idea. And so I kind of stole it and ran with it, and we ran it in the paper. But what I found was that, yes, it got a lot of attention, but the people who served on the basketball committee and the people at the NCAA who ran the tournament appreciated the fact that I took the time to understand the process. And you know, if somebody's put together a bracket and they don't know
Right.
what they're doing,
Yeah.
they've got matchups that are impossible to put together, teams that couldn't possibly meet as early as when they're going to meet. And you know, they could tell that I understood the principles. And you know, as you know, the chairs of those committees are always some of the highest level athletic directors or conference commissioners in the country. It's a big part of me establishing some really good relationships aside from the NCAA basketball committee. They appreciated my work on that. I think it opened some doors for me. I think it opened some doors for me, you know, with athletic administrators, with NCAA officials, with coaches, you know, and others. So it was really, really worth doing.
And that's a really good segue to my next question. Obviously, you were very well respected as not only a good writer, but a knowledgeable writer. You knew what you were talking about, and you were selected for the initial college football playoff selection committee. Just talk about, first of all, how that made you feel to be on that, and then just some of the fun stuff that went with that.
Well, first of all, and Jim Delaney told me this, the Big Ten commissioner, you know, the fact that I had done the bracketology work in basketball played a part in them being interested in me doing the football job. Not that there is bracketology involved, but in terms of analyzing the teams and being able to judge strength of schedule, body of work versus body of work, you know, being able to take a kind of a 30,000 foot view of it and being able to analyze and then drop these teams in the football case into the top 25 rankings and then ultimately a 4-team bracket. But that actually played a part in it. I think, as I mentioned earlier, it really was the capstone to my career. And I had just finished up with USA Today in 2012. The last thing I did actually as a full-time staff member for USA Today was the baseball all-star game here in Kansas City. That was my last assignment. And the fact that I had stepped away from USA Today, was no longer a working journalist, allowed me to be on the committee. First of all, there are a lot of qualified people, I think, to do it, but not people who are still working as journalists, because that would be a real conflict of interest. You know, writing for your paper while you were sitting on that selection committee.
Talk about an inside scoop.
Exactly. And so I was able to be on it. Bill Hancock, who's the executive director of the committee, who used to run the NCAA basketball tournament, also, you know, worked for the Big 8 and the Big 12. You know, certainly he was a big part of me being part of this. I had some good relationships with you know, conference commissioners, with Jim Delaney, with Bob Bowlesby of the Big 12, with Mike Slive of the SEC. So, you know, I was kind of blown away by the opportunity. And, you know, I had taken some, and still do, some pride in being part of the startup of USA Today. And even though I certainly wasn't part of putting together the college football playoff, being part of launch of the playoff from the inside, you know, I take some real pride in. And then a big thing for me was, I mean, I did have relationships with a lot of the other committee members. Certainly, you know, Tom Osborne I knew, and Barry Alvarez, the coach at Wisconsin, or the former coach at Wisconsin. I knew Archie Manning some, but having a good relationship as a writer with somebody like that, there's always a little bit of a arm's length in that relationship. Well, here I was working shoulder to shoulder. I was a colleague. And if I had any doubts about it, they were just immediately dispelled. They treated me as an equal. And I mean, certainly made a point of putting in the work, and I think they respected that. Everybody on that committee put in the work. But it was the thrill of it for me was working side by side with them and not having that arm's length. And I still savor that experience. Of course, there were some people, Condoleezza Rice, who I did not know going in.
Yeah.
And the opportunity to kind of sit across the table from her, be part of something like that with somebody of her ilk, along with everybody else, I'll always be grateful for.
You've been gone from the committee since 2018, so the statute of limitations is used up. So I'm going to put you on the spot. What is the correct number of teams that should be in the college football playoff?
Well, I'll say this. I mean, people, I don't think understand you can't go from 0 to 60, right away. So
Right.
they go from 2 teams being chosen by a numerical formula, computer formula in the old BCS to a 4-team playoff selected by a committee. That was a quantum leap for college football. You're not going to go from the old BCS to 8 teams. And I, to be honest with you, always kind of liked the 4. I think the 4 was a good starting point. And I know that the teams that get left out don't necessarily appreciate this, but I kind of like the desperation that a field of 4 creates, and the fact that, yes, somebody is going to get left out. And, the mantra is every game counts. Well, every game does count.
Yeah.
And I also am very sensitive to the fact, the reason they don't want certainly a 16-team playoff, not some mammoth postseason that so completely overshadows the regular season that it almost renders the regular season not meaningless, but less meaningful, less interesting. We see that with the NCAA now, I think. We have some mildly interesting. If Kansas plays Kentucky or Duke in December someplace, it's interesting, but it's not Armageddon.
Right.
It's not, it's not winner take all, loser is devastated. They're both going to be in the tournament. They're both going to be 1 or number 2 seeds. And people just kind of bide their time until March Madness. Well, they don't want that in college football. They want the regular season to continue to be meaningful. It's where the primary money in college athletics is made.
Right.
Is college football's regular season. Those 12 games during the regular season, and then certainly the postseason. So they wanted to preserve the regular season, and I respect that. Do I think ultimately it will go to 8 teams, to 6 teams, or to 8 teams? I think probably so. But I don't think it's going to, unless something happens more than we've seen to this point, before the 12-year first contract runs out. Now, that doesn't mean we won't know for another 5 years. We're in year 7 of it right now. They'll actually start talking about the future format, whether it stays at 4 or grows beyond 4, sometime maybe a couple of years from now, they may start getting into talks. And I don't know exactly, at least 2 years prior to the end of the 12-year contract, they'll have to have that figured out.
Right.
But I have not been as upset by the 4 teams. There are difficult choices. But I understand why, it is what it is. And I respect the fact. I think it's a good process. Having been inside that room, it's a great process. It is it's an honest process. The 13 people in that room and Bill Hancock and his staff are all trying to do, their best to select the playoff as it is supposed to be selected.
I'm going to wrap up with a couple of questions here. First of all, you stepped away from USA Today in 2012. Just quickly, the rationale behind doing that, were you just tired of traveling, that type of thing? And then how do you get your sports fix now?
Well, I remember it was the 2012 BCS championship game. This was the Alabama LSU rematch
Uh-huh.
in the Sugar Bowl. Talking to one of my close friends in the press box and saying, it really is time, I think, to get out. It's just time to normalize my life. I mean, more and more phone calls, get on a plane now,
Yeah.
and just not having any control over your life. We had a, young family at the time, actually not so young family at that point. And it just was time to kind of get off that carousel.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing, I was getting less and less comfortable, I think, with the profession. I'm an old school guy. I was raised that you write things straight, you keep yourself out of the story, you tell
Mm-hmm.
both sides of the story, you keep yourself out of it, you let the reader decide. And it was becoming more and more, no, you need to be writing with personality because they wanted clicks, and personality is what generated clicks. And it was also kind of the advent of the age of Twitter. And hey, break it, get it up there on Twitter. Even if you still have to do some reporting on it, get it out there, which was against all the instincts of,
Yeah.
no, make sure you're absolutely sure before you put it in any kind of a public forum. It was a kind of a combination of things that told me, yeah, I think it's time. And I've really never had any regrets. I missed the relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely missed the relationships, but I kind of enjoy kicking back and being a fan, which takes me to the second part of your story. How do I get my fix? And part of it was, and I started this when our twin boys were first graders, started coaching them in summer ball, and I coached youth baseball. This, in fact, is the first summer that I stopped doing that, and that's part of my fix. But in terms of fan wise, I just enjoy kicking back and watching games. Being a sports writer, a dispassionate sports writer, sitting in a press box, not showing emotion, and in many cases, you finally don't even feel emotion.
Yeah.
Um, I kind of enjoy being able to sit back, watch a game. And in the case of the Chiefs, I mean, I'm still not a full-fledged fan. I just was a dispassionate sports writer for too long. I don't live and die with the Chiefs, but I'd be lying if I told you I wasn't sitting in my living room, last early February, watching the Super Bowl and just thinking, how great is this? And feeling the same way when the Royals, won the series. And I don't necessarily wish I was in Miami for the Super Bowl win, but I wouldn't have minded being in the stands for the Royals.
Yeah.
I mean, having been there in '85 and watched that long drought and knowing what that meant for the city, and they were such a great team and a
Yeah.
great story.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have minded that might have been the one time that I had some pangs about not actually being at the event and being able to soak in the experience. But for the most part, I enjoy sitting in my living room. When the game is over, click it off, not writing on deadline, going to bed.
Yeah, for sure. And just wrap up with this. Just tell us about your family. Your boys are now 35, your twin sons, and just how things are going for your family.
All good. My one son actually kind of followed me into the sports realm, and he was an assistant commissioner for a Division I basketball conference, the Colonial Athletic Association, for a while, and now works for the National Association of Basketball Coaches in Kansas City. And his twin brother is a successful counselor for troubled youth.
Awesome.
And then our daughter, who was a singer, went to MU and sang there. And she's now a mother of one and expectant second. and they're all here in the area, which is nice to have. So we're
Yeah.
able to stay as close as we can now in the in a time of distancing. And I fortunately went from USA Today into just a wonderful second profession at the Kansas City Public Library, and we had a good chance to have you on to talk about your book on the Chiefs not too long ago. We have tons of evening programming that's actually been one of my favorite things to do in my entire life, authors and other events. I was able to get Condoleezza Rice to come in and speak
Awesome.
a few years ago after we both rolled off the committee. And I've been more than fortunate in my life.
And I'm guessing of all the things you've accomplished, or if you rank them, all the roles that you've had, Grandpa's at the top.
Absolutely. We've got 4 grandkids and 5th one on the way. And even though it was by Zoom, our oldest grandchild, our granddaughter, got a bunny rabbit. All she wanted for Christmas. My wife and I are still kind of shaking our heads that she got it, but it absolutely melts your heart to see her interact with that rabbit. And she calls us via Zoom to show off the rabbit. It just absolutely melts your heart. So you're right.
You can be having the worst day imaginable, and those grandkids come in the front door and say, "Grandpa," and come running across the room, and everything's perfect. So.
What I'm looking forward to doing, I told you I coached our boys and our daughter a little bit too in softball. She was a softball player. But I always look back fondly, the boys and I will always have that all the way through their high school years. We took what was basically our local high school team into the city to play the big boys in the summer. And, we'll always look back fondly on that, and looking forward to when I can, hand the glove and the ball to one of the grandsons and granddaughters and say, okay, let's get started on this.
Yeah, for sure.
Thanks for listening to Sports Connections with David Smale. Make sure to subscribe, follow, and rate the show from your favorite podcast platform. You can learn more about David Smale and his work by visiting davidsmalebooks.com. Don't forget to join us weekly for new episodes. Until next time.